Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast with Michael Becker and Paul Peebles. During this program, you will hear interviews with real-life successful investors who will share their stories and provide useful advice on how to acquire, finance, and operate apartment complexes. Now, here they are, Mike Becker and Paul Peebles.
Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Peebles, National Underwriter for Old Capital, and joining me today is James Eng.
Good morning, Paul.
James is also with Old Capital. Michael Becker's on assignment. So we're lucky to have a gentleman in the podcast today that's going to tell us a little bit about his story about owning apartment buildings. Tom Lafferty is a full-time fire department captain, and he also is an investor in multifamily properties, kind of saying that you can do this and that at the same time. And so we thought we'd bring Tom in, talk a little bit about his last acquisition that he did in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I'm going to kind of kick it over to James, and let's start going.
So, Tom, let's just sort of start a couple years back when you were getting first started in multifamily. How did you get into the business? And then let's talk about your first deal. So how did you get into the business?
Actually, I had been looking for something to do on the side. A lot of firefighters have second jobs. I swore that off from the very beginning. I've been doing this almost 20 years and started hearing about real estate investing on the radio, actually, about a local mentoring group, and started looking into different real estate strategies, single family, flipping, notes, all that good stuff. Randomly ran across a local mentor that taught people how to invest in multifamily, and it was really interesting to me, so I joined that group, and about 6 months later, I owned a small apartment complex.
So let's talk about that deal. So that was a 30-plus unit deal in Garland, right?
32, yes.
So how did you go about finding that deal and getting the financing, and talk us through that process? Because that's usually, going from 0 to 1 is a big hurdle for most people.
It was. I had been wanting to get an 80-plus unit property so that we could get professional management in there. And the mentor that I was working with had a connection with a local broker that was selling this smaller property and came directly to him with it. I resisted getting into this thing because it was going to require self-management, which I knew absolutely nothing about, and finally just decided it was going to be a great way to start and jumped into it.
So that deal, you took full cycle, right? So
I did.
You purchased it in 2014 and you sold it this year? Is that right?
We sold it February of 2014. It was 2 years and 1 day we owned it.
Okay. Wow. So bought it in 14 and sold it in 16.
Correct.
And then, so during those 2 years of managing that 32 units, did you self-manage the whole time?
I did.
Okay. So tell us some of the stuff you learned in that process.
Oh, that would take a while. Honestly, I had heard Ken McElroy, who's a very successful apartment syndicator, talking about how he starts all of his people at the on-site level. They don't just come in and work for the corporation. And I thought, if he's doing it, it would be a great way to learn every part of the business. And I feel like I did. I say self-managed. We had a local on-site manager and an on-site maintenance person, but I was the one overseeing them. So I got to see all the interactions with the tenants. I got to be involved in all the rehab, deciding what was going to be replaced versus repaired, what the effect of raising rents did. I just really learned every part of it.
So during that process, what was the toughest part of that? How much time did that take? I mean, a lot of people are scared of getting into that part of the business, especially taking on something that small. So how much time did that take at the beginning when you were doing the rehab versus, towards the end when you actually sold the property?
Well, we were actually doing the rehab the whole 2 years because we couldn't get people to leave. We kept raising rents, hoping they would leave so we could rehab the apartment because we only had a year to use our renovation funds, but we couldn't get anyone to leave. So we were constantly, doing a unit here, a unit there. But in the beginning, it took, let's say I was there a lot. But I probably didn't have to be. Again, it was just wanting to learn and be involved. So I was there probably 3 or 4 times a week. Finally realized after about 4 or 5 months that I was just there for no reason. Things were going smoothly. Our manager had everything going well and just started tapering off the visits. But being my first deal, I kind of felt like I needed to be there. I was using other people's money for this deal, which really kind of scared me. So I felt like I needed to be watching over everything all the time. By the end of the ownership, I was there probably once a month.
Okay. All right. So it's running pretty smooth.
Let's talk a little bit more about this transaction. Tom and I have known each other for a long period of time. Our daughters have played volleyball, and Tom and I have spent many hours with screaming girls in the middle of a loud volleyball arena on a Saturday and a Sunday. So he had time to kind of study the multifamily business. This property that you bought over in Garland, give us an age of the property.
It was a 1964 property with a chiller system, which is a little bit less desirable setup for heating and cooling, which was one of my concerns. But it had been renovated by another ownership group, so it was a stable property. Yeah, so 1964.
And tell me a little bit about the submarket itself. Was there a lot of 1964 properties in and around the submarket, or was it brand new buildings? Tell me a little bit about.
The whole street was pretty much that same era. Initially, since I was new to multifamily, that worried me.
Why did that worry you that there was a lot more competition on the street?
It's kind of hard to get your head around initially. When you're visiting these properties, you're almost looking at them as if you're going to live in them. Mm-hmm. And it's really just a solid working class neighborhood with people that are probably making $20,000 to $30,000 to $35,000 per year. It was a learning process on how to evaluate these areas.
And what type of amenities were on the property?
That would be none.
Was there a pool on the property?
There used to be. It was now a grassy area. Still had the skimmers and the coping around the edge, but the pool was gone, and that pretty much was it. That was another concern I had is some of the other properties had pools.
So in and around that neighborhood itself, a lot of older properties that were built in the 60s, maybe the 70s itself, I would probably say on that street there was probably 8 apartment buildings, maybe around the corner. Right. There's probably about 3 or 4. I actually like when we have other apartment buildings in and around the area. It's almost like a car dealership that if you're always by yourself, sometimes that's not going to draw a crowd to that area. People want to rent an apartment just like they want to buy a car, and that's why you'll see car dealerships clustered all together. That actually helps the area. That pushes occupancy higher in and around that area when they're all clustered together. Tell me a little bit about this chiller system. Did you have it checked out before you bought the property? What did you find out after you bought it?
We did have it checked out, but we were buying it the process was going on through December and January. And with a chiller system, you cannot switch it easily from heating to cooling. So it was on heat at the time. Once we got into the summer, we found out that the pump that circulates the water through the system was dramatically smaller than it needed to be. So that was a little bit of an expense to repair, but that was really the only surprise we had.
How much money did the seller spend on the property before you guys bought it? Do you recall?
I seem to recall that they spent $300,000 or $400,000.
Okay, and how much, after you guys took it over, how much did you guys have to spend?
We only put about $60,000 into it.
And where did that go into?
That was primarily interior upgrades only.
Okay. And then when you say you self-managed, did you actually have a management company, or did you kind of share a manager with another property?
We did not have a management company. That was the role I played. So I had to pay the on-site staff. I had to shop for the materials for the rehabs, manage the contractors somewhat. Our manager helped with that. But yeah, we did have a local manager that ran the property next door. So she helped out with leasing our units and taking maintenance requests.
How did you find that to be when you share a manager with another property that is not owned by you?
It worked out very well for us. Only I think because every property in the area was 100% full all the time. And continuously through the 2 years of ownership, I knew that if occupancy softened at all, we were going to have to find another arrangement, just because if we each had vacant units, I knew what she would be leasing first. So it worked out well for us in this case, but probably only because of the very high occupancy.
Before you got into this property, I mean, you were a captain in the fire department.
Correct.
So you've seen a lot of properties out there that you probably had a lot of calls on that. So you had some initial concerns about even buying a property in and around your area. That you pretty much did not want to do that. You didn't want to be the apartment building that everybody knew that the captain owned this.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and actually there's a few for sale right now around the station where I work that I've come full circle. I would love to own them.
So you actually through the eyes of somebody that's actually worked on apartments, when the apartments were actually maybe on fire or slip and fall and things like that. I mean, you had a better sense of health and safety, initial problems that properties of this age have. Anything that in your mind that you can think of that you came around to try to cure?
On the properties that we've purchased, there really hasn't been anything that was too big a concern for health and safety. I do see some properties in my job that when I walk in now, I look at them differently and I think,
Sure.
Oh boy, this one would be a nightmare to own, or boy, this would be great. But for the most part, not too many concerns.
How about roofs? How was the roof on that property? Any concerns about the roof?
Well, we had it inspected and it got okayed to go forward. And then just before closing, I happened to go up there myself, and I'm not a roof expert at all. I just happened to go look at it. And we found a large section that was not even attached to the building. So we had to go back to the seller and get a small discount for that.
Anything on that property that you would think is funny that people would chuckle about that deal?
Well, there's a guy that lives at the property next door that anyone who's been over there typically runs into. Sometimes they call him the Birdman. He is a longtime 15-year resident of the property next door, and he has a big plastic costume that he has created, and he wears it always. If you ever see him out of his apartment, which is pretty often, he's in this outfit. He has a long blonde wig. He has a fake police badge sticker hanging around his neck. The city police department knows him very, very well, and he calls himself our security. So anyone who has been over there is usually pretty astounded at what they're running into.
But that's not on your property. That's in the property next door.
Well, it's the property next door, but he kind of latched on to me as his friend, and yeah, he spent a lot of time at ours.
Well, you needed a security officer.
That's right. That's right.
Good.
That's great, Tom. Let's move into this acquisition that you just closed, and let's just start from the beginning. So how did you find the 78 unit that you just closed?
I actually found this deal on LoopNet, which everyone says there are no good deals on there, but this one popped up last January, I believe, had no information about it, just a phone number and a price, no pictures, nothing, which should have clued me in to what this process was going to be like. But I called the agent on it, who happened to be the owner's wife, and 6 months later, we closed on it.
So January of this year, you found it on LoopNet, and then, so talk about what type of due diligence you got from them to sort of make a decision and put an offer on this deal.
From the seller?
From the seller.
Ooh, virtually nothing. We finally got a very rough set of financials and a rent roll. I believe we went under contract in May, and I think it was the end of May before I ever got anything. And it was very roughly put together. They had been telling me all along that they had a computer crash and lost all their records. So
They broke their pencil?
I believe so. Yeah. Well, and actually, their rent roll was the most complicated thing I have ever seen, and anyone I've shown it to has ever seen. There were two owners on this property, one local, one in Washington. He's a Microsoft executive, and I suspect he created this thing in his
He created the rent
Microsoft
roll,
way.
but they didn't have financials. So
Correct.
that was the ironic thing. And so I guess, what did you like about this deal? Enough for you to push forward through not having financials, and how did you get comfortable getting under contract?
Well, initially, it was smaller than I wanted, so I was looking at it for other people, but nobody seemed to have any interest in it. And when I walked the property, I really liked the way it was laid out. It's in a great neighborhood, surrounded by really nice single-family houses, and it just had a good feel to it, and I felt like it had a lot of potential. Probably the biggest pro to it was that I was working directly with this seller. We had a lot of rapport, and I knew there was not a lot of competition, or I thought there wasn't.
Why was he selling it?
The local owner was, well, going back, he had owned it since 1991 and sold it in 2007 to the Washington owner. And that guy hired a property management company that within 3 months had nearly bankrupted him. They were using his rehab dollars to fix other properties. And so he brought the original sellers back in to run it for him, but reportedly would not turn over any funds to renovate the property. And as an example, there were some units that were vacant in 2007 when the local owner sold it, and they are still vacant today almost 10 years.
So let's go back to sort of beginning. You got it under contract, did your inspections, and then how did you decide on how to finance this thing because of lack of financials? And
I called Paul and James.
So you called us, and then do you remember what we did next? What was our sort of first step?
I remember very well what happened initially. I had toured the property several times and called Paul all excited saying, hey, I've got the inside track on this deal and get me a great loan. Let's go forward. And Paul said, hold on a second. And he got in his car and went over there and sent me somehow he worked his way into the back office, which I had not been able to do. And he sent me some pictures of a whiteboard with red dry erase marker all over it, describing all the roof leaks that were going on. And I had been told it had new roofs. So he did some detective work for me and said I better get ready for a very low LTV loan.
So you were thinking 60, 65%?
60 to 65 is what I had been using in my analysis for about a month.
Okay. And then once we got engaged, we got the lender out to the property and walked the property with you. And from there, so what did they term sheet to you at that point?
We ended up with a 75% LTV, 4.5% interest, 5-year note, no prepayment penalty. It was a very strong loan, and they were actually ready to move really quickly. It was me kind of holding up the process, honestly.
So we got out there, walked the property with Tom, and they had approval, I think, within maybe a week and a half of you putting in the deposit.
That's correct.
And then we got the third parties back about 2 weeks after the deposit.
Right.
It took probably 30 days from the deposit to close.
It was very quick.
Right.
Yeah, I was hesitant to move forward just because there were so many unknowns on this property. We were trying to get good bids for repairs and getting roofers out there and waiting on better financials. But yeah, the bank and James in particular were ready to go and constantly calling me, asking for the deposit or, whatever financial paperwork they needed. But once we turned all that in, it was very quick.
I think the takeaway is going to be on a conversation with Tom like this is that this was a very difficult transaction just because the quality and the condition of the asset itself. I really liked the location, but was very concerned about the amount of deferred maintenance on the property going into it and having bad financials on the deal. Not every lender is going to do a deal like this. I would say 99.9% of lenders are not going to do a deal like this or to get the terms that James was able to get. So that's one of the benefits. And I'm not going to toot our horn, but work with a professional that kind of knows lending. There's something to be said about going direct to the lender, but I will tell you this, after doing this for 32 years, is that work with a mortgage banker, broker that has multiple venues, because if you choose one bank and that bank commits to the deal, and then all of a sudden, the salesperson that is the lender can't get the board to agree to do the transaction and the deal falls apart, and you may be at risk for not just $1,000, but tens of thousands of dollars, you need to have an alternative, another place for you to get the money for the the 70 or 75 or even 80% of the funds available for the loan. So one lender can only represent themselves, but working with a professional that has multiple venues is going to save you time and money. And just like the things that we talk about, this business is a relationship business. They want to make sure that you are able to close and close on time. And these transactions for sellers, they don't care where you get the money from, just as long as you close on time or on a timely basis. So my takeaway in this conversation with Tom and with James is really work with a professional that kind of knows what the hell they're doing.
I'll also add there were a few times during the process I felt like I knew what I was doing with the lender and basically just started talking directly with the bank pretty quickly. But having James to go to, there were a few situations where something came up and James said, hey, let me have that conversation with the bank. I'm glad I did. It's something where there are certain things that came up that the bank could have easily said no to me, just a single guy that they don't even know, but they are less likely to say no to Old Capital, who works with them constantly. So it was definitely worth having somebody doing that work for me.
So this is the third transaction with this bank in the last 2 months or so that I've done with them, and there'll probably be 3 or 4 more behind it. So when we make a request, it's a very different request than if Tom, who's doing one deal this year and maybe another deal next year, makes the request. So it gives us a little bit more negotiating power.
Yeah, Tom is
lender.
Tom's the borrower, but to the bank, we're the client, and they don't really want to piss off the client, us, and they're going to be very flexible in what they want to do because they want to get more business through us.
Right.
Well, it was funny. We were standing on the property with the bank execs, and one of them said, "Hey, we'd be willing to give you a little bit of a drop in your interest rate if you would go to a 20-year amortization instead of 25." And before I could even answer, James said, "No, we want 25." And they said, "Yeah, he always beats us up on that." So I don't think I could have done that myself.
So every little bit helps. And so when you do bring business and have the relationship, that's the reason I think, we had the guys out there walking the property because I wanted them to be comfortable with it before you even put your deposit down. Right. So we had them out in the property a couple days after you called me and just had not only the loan officer, but the market president out there to make sure that this got through approval the first time correctly.
We want to be transparent to the bank because as James and I and the rest of the capital people, we're all ex-bankers. And so we want to be told the real story, and we want to talk to the borrower directly. We want to make sure that the borrower has a good relationship with the bank starting off, and that everybody understands exactly where everybody's coming from. So we're very big into relationships and making sure everybody has the total truth about what's going on.
So you've done a couple of transactions now, Tom. What would you, maybe some advice for yourself 2-3 years ago when you're first starting out, what would you like to know after you've been in the business now for a couple of years?
Oh, probably the biggest thing I struggle with, and I heard Paul mention it on another podcast you guys did recently, was going forward, how aggressive to be. I tend to be very, very conservative, and I've made probably 12 offers this year, maybe 10 or 12, and gotten to best and final on a few, but only landed this one 78 unit. So if somebody could tell me exactly where the market's going to be in 2 or 3 years, that'd be great.
How frustrating has that been, though, for you?
It's been pretty frustrating, but honestly, it's a great learning experience. I mean, I'm constantly hitting up these guys and the mentor I work with. I think it's super important to work with someone who knows what they're doing. There are just so many ways you could get burned in this business. I mean, one small error could be magnified huge when you look 3, 4, 5 years out.
Who's managing this property for you?
We are using a management company called Allied, and the president and owner of that company owns a very similar property right down the street in the same city. So I was really glad to have him on board. He's very experienced in the exact market and with that type of property.
So is he handling the rehab portion of that, or is you managing that piece of it?
We're still kind of working on that. He will probably be doing a lot of it because they hired a construction arm of their company just recently, and we may be one of the first properties to use them. So it's going to be a joint effort, I think.
Any funny stories on this property when you guys took the property over?
Well, it was just about a week ago, and
and stop rolling your eyes when I say that.
We're still sorting through a lot of stuff, but I think the day of closing, when our management company went and actually took possession of the property, one of the first things that happened was the sellers handed them a coffee can with cash, $1,500 in cash, and said, "Here's the rent we collected in the last couple of days." And this was very late in the month, and they had only collected, I think, about 30,000 of the typical 40 to 42,000 they would collect in a normal month. So I thought we were just going to get burned on the difference. And the seller told me, "Oh no, there's a lot of people that pay weekly, so you'll probably collect some." So we had people coming by wanting to pay in cash, which is a very undesirable situation for the management company. But there's going to be a big retraining of the tenants. So I don't know about funny, but just a whole lot of things to sort through.
Just when you guys were looking at the property originally, you're doing your due diligence in the property, and I happened to walk into the property to take a look and took some pictures of what's on the dry eraser board. When you do your due diligence, make sure you take pictures on things on the dry eraser board because it'll give you kind of the heart and minds of what's going on, where the ownership group may tell you that the property is doing great, but the property manager is showing the true performance typically on the dry eraser board. So make sure you take some pictures of that so you can just have some additional ammunition for any conversations you want to have, possibly to retrade the deal.
We actually were working on a retrade on this property several different times during the process, but there's a a property just down the street that sold for a really high price, and our seller knew that. And so he was just itching for me to hit him with a retrade because he really wanted to list with that same broker who was constantly calling him and wanting to list the property. So we didn't have a lot of luck with that.
Yeah, we closed that transaction too.
Yes, that's correct. Well, and another local broker, one of the more active ones, was personally trying to buy this same property, which I was not aware of until after I had it under contract. So I did have a little bit of competition.
There's always competition in this market, whether you know it or not.
That's true.
And so any parting words or advice for our listeners who are just getting started, or anything else you'd like to add?
I would just say, don't feel like apartments are unachievable. I started out directly in apartments, and my first deal was as a deal sponsor. I'm also invested passively in several other ones now, but you can start off straight into multifamily. Just get a good mentor, somebody that knows what they're doing.
That's great. Tom, thanks for hanging out with us. We appreciate your business. And, I think Tom tells you a little bit how it is. And, he avoided the procrastination about getting into this business. He went directly into becoming a deal sponsor. He was the guy that put the transaction together. He brought in the investors to become investors with them. Had a direct relationship with James to put the loan together. And now he's going to be the guy that's going to be running the transaction. So, Tom, we wish you the best of luck. Thanks for coming into the podcast. James, thanks for helping us and getting this conversation going. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom, for coming in, doing the podcast this morning. If people want to reach out to Tom, you can reach him at tdmultifamily@gmail.com. Again, that's tdmultifamily@gmail.com. And if any of the listeners want to receive our white paper on multifamily finance, you can send an email to info@oldcapitallending.com. Again, info@oldcapitallending.com. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating. That really helps us reach more listeners out there. And also in September, we are going to have a Fight of the Century is what we're billing it as. So September 21st, mark your calendars here in Grapevine at 7 o'clock. We are going to have a lender from the Fannie Mae side and the Freddie Mac side. So
the Fight of the Century.
So come here, pros, cons, what's newest in the markets that you're interested in acquiring in, and hear about their different loan programs that are available.
That's great. Thanks, James.
Thank you for listening to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. Please join us at oldcapitallending.com to sign up for our weekly email updates. We'll see you here next week with another great interview.